A thundering crack of gunfire echoed across the plains as the Bentonville stagecoach lurched forward with frightening speed. Its terrified driver slumped over the reins with a bullet in his shoulder. Inside, Lydia Caldwell clutched the worn leather seat with white knuckles, her breath coming in sharp gasps as the world outside became a dangerous blur of dust and chaos. It was supposed to be a simple journey to start her new life as a schoolteacher in Arkansas. But now, in the spring of 1875, she found herself facing death on a runaway coach with no one to hear her screams but the unforgiving western wind. The stagecoach bounced violently over the rocky terrain, each jolt threatening to throw Lydia from her seat. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, whipping around her face as she struggled to maintain her balance. The elderly couple who had been her traveling companions lay unconscious on the floor, thrown there when the first shots rang out and the coach lurched into its deadly race. "Help! Somebody help us!" Lydia screamed through the window, but her voice was lost to the thundering of hooves and the creaking of wood as the coach threatened to splinter apart at any moment. Miles away, or so it seemed, the sound of another set of hoofbeats rose above the chaos. Through tear-blurred vision, Lydia caught sight of a rider on a powerful Palomino horse, galloping alongside the trail. The man wore a dust-covered hat pulled low over his eyes, his lean form bent forward as he urged his mount faster. Nathan Keller had been tracking a band of stage robbers for 2 days when he heard the gunshots. The bounty wasn't worth much, but the territory marshal had promised him steady work if he could bring in the Decker gang. Now, watching the stage careen wildly down the trail toward certain destruction, the bounty was the furthest thing from his mind. Nathan dug his heels into his horse's sides, guiding the animal closer to the runaway coach. The gap between them closed gradually as his Palomino, Thunder, responded to his urgings. Nathan could see a woman's face at the window now, her expression a mix of terror and desperate hope. "Hold on," he shouted, though he knew she couldn't hear him. The ravine up ahead meant certain death if he couldn't stop the stage in time. With practiced skill, Nathan urged Thunder closer until they were running parallel to the lead horses. The stage's team was in a blind panic, eyes rolling white with fear as they charged forward without guidance. Nathan took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and then did the only thing he could. He leapt from his saddle onto the back of the nearest stagecoach horse. The impact nearly knocked the wind from his lungs as he landed astride the frightened animal. He gripped its mane with one hand, fighting for balance while reaching for the bridle with the other. The horse bucked beneath him, nearly sending him tumbling beneath the deadly wheels. Inside the coach, Lydia gasped as she saw the man's daring leap. Her heart seemed to stop as he wavered precariously between the horses, and then resumed its frantic beating when he managed to steady himself. Nathan worked his way forward along the team, moving from horse to horse until he reached the lead pair. Sweat streamed down his face beneath his hat as he fought to gain control, speaking in low, calming tones to the frightened animals. Gradually, he managed to grasp the reins and begin pulling back. "Whoa! Whoa there!" he called, his voice strong and steady despite the danger. The horses began to respond, their pace slowing incrementally. The stagecoach continued to sway dangerously as Nathan guided the team into a wide turn away from the ravine. The wheels skidded in the loose earth, and for one heart-stopping moment, it seemed the coach would tip over. But then it righted itself, and the horses slowed to a trot, then a walk, before finally coming to a halt. Nathan slid from the lead horse's back, his legs shaky from exertion and fading adrenaline. He stumbled to the side of the coach and wrenched open the door. "Is everyone all right?" he called, his voice rough from the dust. Lydia stared at her rescuer, taking in his weathered face and concerned blue eyes. Relief flooded through her so strongly that she nearly collapsed. "The driver's been shot," she managed to say, her voice trembling, "and the Hendersons are hurt." She gestured to the elderly couple still lying on the floor of the coach. Nathan nodded, assessing the situation quickly. "Let me check on the driver first, then I'll help them." "Can you stand?" Lydia nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain her legs would support her. She gathered her skirts and moved toward the door, accepting Nathan's outstretched hand. The moment their hands touched, a strange jolt passed through her, something beyond the lingering fear and relief. "I'm Nathan Keller," he said as he helped her down. "I've been tracking the men who did this." "Lydia Caldwell," she replied, finally finding solid ground beneath her feet. "Thank you, you saved our lives." Nathan's eyes met hers for a brief moment before he turned his attention to the driver. "Those men are still out there. We need to get somewhere safe." He climbed up to check on the driver, who was still breathing but badly wounded. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, and he'd lost a significant amount of blood. "He needs a doctor fast," Nathan called down to Lydia. "We're about 5 miles outside of Bentonville. I can get us there if you can help me with the Hendersons." Together, they managed to rouse the elderly couple. Mrs. Henderson had suffered a nasty bump to her head, and Mr. Henderson's wrist appeared to be broken, but they were otherwise intact. Nathan helped Lydia settle them back onto the coach seats, then carefully brought the wounded driver inside as well, propping him against the side with makeshift bandages torn from Nathan's own shirt. "I'll drive," Nathan said, closing the door. "Keep pressure on his wound. We'll be in town soon." Lydia nodded, her hands already pressed against the driver's shoulder. As Nathan climbed to the driver's seat and took up the reins, she found herself studying the faces of her fellow passengers. The Hendersons looked frightened but grateful, and the driver, a man named Jim according to his name tag, was drifting in and out of consciousness. "It's going to be all right," she told them, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Mr. Keller is taking us to town." The journey to Bentonville seemed interminable, each jolt of the coach causing Jim to moan in pain. But true to his word, Nathan drove them steadily toward safety, occasionally calling down to check on their status. As the buildings of Bentonville came into view, Lydia felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. She had come so close to death today, and yet here she was, alive because a stranger had risked everything to save them. The stagecoach rolled into town, drawing immediate attention. Nathan brought it to a stop directly in front of the doctor's office, jumping down and calling for assistance. "We've got wounded," he shouted, and several men rushed to help. In the commotion that followed, Lydia found herself standing on the boardwalk, watching as Jim and the Hendersons were carried into the doctor's office. Nathan spoke briefly with the town sheriff, explaining what had happened, then returned to her side. "Are you hurt anywhere?" he asked, his eyes scanning her with concern. Lydia shook her head. "Just shaken. I can't thank you enough for what you did." A small smile crossed Nathan's face, softening his weathered features. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Lydia said firmly. "What you did was extraordinary." "You could have been killed." Nathan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "You were supposed to arrive at the schoolhouse today, weren't you? Mrs. Peterson's been talking about the new teacher coming for weeks." Lydia blinked in surprise. "Yes, I'm the new schoolteacher. How did you know?" "Small town," Nathan replied. "Word travels. Mrs. Peterson runs the boarding house where you'll be staying. I can take you there if you'd like." Lydia nodded gratefully. "That would be most kind. My trunks." "They're still on the coach," Nathan assured her. "I'll have them delivered." As they walked down the main street of Bentonville, Lydia became acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. Her dress was torn and dust-covered, her hair a wild tangle around her shoulders. Nathan didn't seem to notice the attention, or perhaps he was simply accustomed to it. "Have you been in Bentonville long?" Lydia asked, trying to distract herself from the events of the day. "About 6 months," Nathan replied. "I do odd jobs, some tracking. The marshal hires me sometimes to bring in wanted men, like the ones who attacked our coach." Nathan nodded, his expression hardening. "The Decker gang. They've been hitting stages all over the territory. This is the first time they've shot a driver, though. They're getting bolder." They arrived at a neat 2-story house with a sign reading Peterson's boarding house hanging from the porch. A plump, gray-haired woman burst through the door before they had even climbed the steps. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed, taking in Lydia's disheveled appearance. "We heard about the stage." "Are you all right, Miss Caldwell?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Peterson," Lydia assured her. "Thanks to Mr. Keller." Mrs. Peterson turned her attention to Nathan, her expression warming. "Nathan Keller, always in the thick of things. Come inside, both of you. Miss Caldwell needs tea and rest, and you look like you could use a meal." Nathan removed his hat, revealing dark hair damp with sweat. "Thank you, madam, but I should get back to the sheriff's office. We need to organize a posse to go after the Decker gang while the trail's still fresh." Mrs. Peterson tutted disapprovingly but didn't argue. "At least come for supper tonight, 6 o'clock sharp." Nathan hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be obliged, madam." His eyes flickered to Lydia. "If you need anything before then, the sheriff's office is just down the street." As he turned to leave, Lydia impulsively reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you again, Mr. Keller. I owe you my life." Something flickered in his eyes, something warm that made Lydia's heart beat a little faster. "Nathan," he corrected gently. "And you don't owe me anything, Miss Caldwell." "Lydia," she replied with a small smile. He nodded, replacing his hat. "Lydia, I'll see you at supper." As he walked away, Lydia felt Mrs. Peterson's curious gaze on her. "Quite the dramatic entrance to our little town," the older woman said, ushering Lydia inside. "But you couldn't have had a better man come to your rescue. Nathan Keller's one of the finest men in these parts, though he'd be the last to say so." Lydia followed Mrs. Peterson into the cool interior of the boarding house, her mind still filled with images of the day's events and of the man who had saved her life. Mrs. Peterson showed Lydia to a modest but comfortable room on the 2nd floor. "The bathroom's at the end of the hall," she explained. "I'll have hot water brought up so you can wash. Your trunks should arrive shortly." Left alone, Lydia sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally catching up to her. Her hands trembled as she removed her torn gloves, and she realized that she was on the verge of tears. The magnitude of what had happened, how close she had come to death, and how miraculous her rescue had been overwhelmed her. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. A young maid entered with a copper tub and was soon followed by 2 boys carrying buckets of steaming water. "Mrs. Peterson says to take your time, miss," the maid said kindly. "Supper's not for hours yet." The bath was precisely what Lydia needed. As she sank into the warm water, she felt the tension begin to leave her body. Her thoughts drifted to Nathan Keller, to his quiet strength, and the way his blue eyes had looked when they met hers. There had been something there, something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. By the time Lydia had bathed and dressed in a simple blue dress from her trunk, which had indeed been delivered as promised, she felt almost human again. She made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Peterson in the kitchen, supervising the preparation of what appeared to be a feast. "There you are," the landlady exclaimed. "Feeling better, I hope. You've got some color back in your cheeks." "Much better, thank you," Lydia replied, surveying the bustling activity. "Can I help with anything?" Mrs. Peterson waved her off. "Not today. You've been through enough. Sit down and have some tea while I finish up here." Lydia obediently took a seat at the kitchen table, accepting the cup of tea Mrs. Peterson poured for her. "Is all this just for supper?" she asked, gesturing to the impressive array of food being prepared. "We've got a full house tonight, Mrs. Peterson explained. "All my regular boarders, plus the sheriff's coming, and Nathan, of course. News of your adventure has spread through town. Everyone wants to meet the new schoolteacher with such a dramatic story." Lydia felt a blush creep into her cheeks. "I wasn't hoping to make quite such a spectacle of myself on my first day." Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. "Nonsense. It's not every day we get excitement like this. Besides, it'll give the children something to talk about when school starts next week. They'll be hanging on your every word." At precisely 6 o'clock, the dining room of the boarding house was filled with the chatter of a dozen people. Lydia met her fellow boarders, two elderly spinster sisters who taught piano, a young bank clerk, the town's telegraph operator, and a widow who worked at the general store. Sheriff Collins arrived with his deputy, full of questions about the Stagecoach robbery, which Lydia answered as best she could. Nathan was the last to arrive, clean-shaven and wearing a fresh shirt, though he still had the weathered look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. His eyes found Lydia immediately, and the small smile he gave her made her heart flutter unexpectedly. Mrs. Peterson seated Lydia between Nathan and the sheriff, an arrangement that allowed the lawman to continue his questions throughout the meal while giving Lydia the comfort of her rescuer's steady presence beside her. "Did you manage to track them?" Sheriff Collins asked Nathan between bites of Mrs. Peterson's excellent beef stew. Nathan shook his head. "Lost the trail about 3 miles north of town. They split up, headed in different directions, but they'll meet up again somewhere. They always do." "Any idea why they're getting more violent?" the sheriff pressed. "Shooting the driver like that." "They're desperate," Nathan replied, his voice low enough that only Lydia and the sheriff could hear. "The railroad's pushing through. Stage robberies will be a thing of the past once the line reaches Bentonville. They're trying to get as much as they can before that happens." Lydia listened with interest. She had known that the railroad was expanding throughout the territories, but she hadn't considered its effect on outlaws like the ones who had attacked her stagecoach. "When is the railroad expected to reach Bentonville?" she asked. "By year's end, if the weather holds," Sheriff Collins answered. "It's already brought more people to town, as you can see." He gestured around the table. "Most of these folks weren't here 2 years ago." After dinner, the party moved to the parlor for coffee. Lydia found herself next to Nathan on a small settee, acutely aware of his presence. "How are you really doing?" he asked quietly, while the others were engaged in a lively debate about the railroad's impact on local businesses. Lydia considered the question. "Better than I expected, honestly. I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't come along, but then I remind myself that you did, and we're all safe because of it." Nathan nodded, his eyes studying her face. "You're stronger than you might think, Lydia Caldwell. Many would still be in hysterics after what you went through today." "I've had my share of challenges," Lydia admitted. "My parents died of fever 3 years ago. I've been teaching in St. Louis since then, living with my aunt. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Bentonville, it seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start." "Why Bentonville?" Nathan asked curiously. "It's not exactly a metropolis," Lydia smiled. "Perhaps that's why. St. Louis was overwhelming at times. And my aunt, while kind, has very fixed ideas about how a young lady should behave. I wanted to go somewhere I could be myself." "And who is that?" Nathan's voice was soft, his eyes intent on her face. Lydia met his gaze. "I'm still figuring that out." The conversation might have continued, but Mrs. Peterson called for Lydia's attention, introducing her to the town's doctor who had just arrived with news about Jim, the stagecoach driver. "He'll recover," the doctor assured her. "The bullet missed anything vital. He's mostly suffering from blood loss and the jostling he took on that wild ride. The Hendersons are staying at my place tonight as a precaution, but they should be fine as well." Relief washed over Lydia. "Thank you, doctor. That's wonderful news." As the evening wore on, Lydia found herself repeatedly seeking out Nathan with her eyes, only to find him already watching her. There was something about him that drew her, something beyond the fact that he had saved her life. He had a quiet strength, a steadiness that was comforting after the chaos of the day. When the gathering finally began to disperse, Nathan approached her once more. "I'll be heading out early tomorrow to meet with the territorial marshal about the Decker gang," he said. "But I wanted to make sure you were settling in all right." "I am," Lydia assured him. "Mrs. Peterson has been very kind and everyone has made me feel welcome." Nathan nodded, seeming pleased. "The school's just a short walk from here. If you'd like, I could show you around town when I get back." "Help you get your bearings." Lydia felt a surge of pleasure at the offer. "I'd like that very much." "Good." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I should be back by Sunday, perhaps after church." "I'll look forward to it," Lydia replied. Suddenly shy, Nathan tipped his hat to her. "Good night, Lydia. Sleep well." As she watched him leave, Lydia knew that her fresh start in Bentonville had taken an unexpected turn. She had come seeking independence and a new beginning, but she hadn't anticipated meeting someone like Nathan Keller on her very first day, a man who had literally leapt from his horse to a runaway stagecoach to save her life. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity as Lydia prepared for the start of the school term. She met with the town school board, arranged her classroom, and continued to settle into life at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with rows of wooden desks, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, and a small desk at the front for the teacher. It would be Lydia's responsibility to teach children from age 6 to 14. A challenging prospect, but one she felt prepared for after her years of teaching in St. Louis. Throughout her preparations, Lydia found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to Nathan Keller. She had learned more about him from the town gossip that flowed freely at Mrs. Peterson's dinner table. He had come to Bentonville 6 months earlier, a stranger with a reputation for tracking and bringing in wanted men. He kept to himself mostly, taking odd jobs between his work for the marshal. Nobody seemed to know much about his past, but he was well respected for his honest dealings and willingness to help when needed. Sunday arrived, and Lydia dressed with particular care for church, selecting a pale yellow dress that her aunt had insisted was too frivolous for a schoolteacher, but which Lydia had packed anyway. As she pinned her hair in a neat chignon, she told herself that her attention to her appearance had nothing to do with the possibility of seeing Nathan again. The small white church at the edge of town was filled to capacity when Lydia arrived with Mrs. Peterson. She was introduced to so many people that she doubted she would remember half their names, but everyone was welcoming, many expressing sympathy for her ordeal on the stagecoach. To her disappointment, Nathan wasn't among the congregation. As the service concluded and people filed out into the bright sunlight, Lydia tried to hide her disappointment. "He'll be here," Mrs. Peterson said beside her, a knowing look in her eyes. "Nathan Keller's a man of his word." Lydia felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure he's busy with his work for the marshal." Mrs. Peterson just smiled and moved off to speak with the pastor, leaving Lydia standing alone on the church steps. She was about to return to the boarding house when she spotted a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Nathan looked tired, dust covering his clothes and a day's growth of beard shadowing his jaw, but his eyes brightened when he saw her. He dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, then made his way through the dispersing crowd to where she stood. "I apologize for my appearance," he said, removing his hat. "We just got back to town." "Did you find them, the Decker gang?" Lydia asked. A grim satisfaction crossed Nathan's face. "3 of them. They're in the territorial jail now. 2 more still out there, but they'll think twice before hitting another stagecoach." Lydia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The knowledge that most of the men who had attacked her stagecoach were now in custody brought a sense of closure to her ordeal. "Are you still up for that tour of town?" Nathan asked. "I understand if you'd prefer to wait until I'm more presentable." Lydia smiled. "I'd still like to go, unless you're too tired." Nathan shook his head. "Never too tired for pleasant company. Let me just see to thunder, and I'll meet you at Mrs. Peterson's in an hour." True to his word, Nathan arrived at the boarding house precisely an hour later, clean-shaven and wearing fresh clothes. He offered Lydia his arm as they set out to explore Bentonville. The town was larger than Lydia had initially realized, boasting not only the essential business's general store, bank, doctor's office, but also a small hotel, a dressmaker's shop, and even a photography studio. Nathan seemed to know everyone, exchanging nods with passers-by as he pointed out various landmarks. "The town's growing fast," he explained as they walked. "The promise of the railroad has brought new businesses and settlers. A year from now, you might not recognize the place." "Do you think that's a good thing?" Lydia asked, curious about his perspective. Nathan considered the question. "Progress is inevitable, I suppose. The railroad brings opportunities, makes life easier in some ways. But it changes things too. Some of those changes aren't always for the better." "You prefer the old ways," a smile touched his lips. "I prefer open spaces and the freedom to move when and where I choose. Railroad towns tend to get crowded." "Is that why you became a tracker? For the freedom?" Nathan glanced down at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "That's part of it. I've never been one for staying in one place too long." "Yet you've been in Bentonville for 6 months," Lydia observed. "That seems like a long time for someone who doesn't like to settle." "It does, doesn't it?" Nathan replied thoughtfully. "I meant to pass through, but something about this place." He trailed off, his eyes scanning the town square where children played under the watchful eyes of their parents. "Maybe I was just tired of moving." They continued their walk, stopping occasionally to rest on benches or to speak with townsfolk who invariably wanted to hear Lydia's account of the runaway stagecoach. By the time they returned to the boarding house, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks. "Thank you for the tour," Lydia said as they stood on the porch. "I feel much more oriented now." "It was my pleasure," Nathan replied, his eyes warm as they met hers. "Perhaps we could do this again sometime. There's a nice spot by the creek just outside of town. Good place for a picnic if you'd be interested." Lydia felt a flutter of anticipation. "I'd like that very much." "Sunday after next," Nathan suggested. "I've got to head back out with the marshal this week, but I should be back by then." Lydia nodded, trying to hide her disappointment at the wait. "Sunday after next." As Nathan walked away, tipping his hat to her one last time before disappearing around the corner, Lydia hugged the memory of the afternoon to herself. There was something special happening between them, something unexpected and thrilling. The next 2 weeks passed slowly for Lydia, filled with the start of the school term and the challenges of getting to know her new students. There were 27 children enrolled, ranging from shy 6-year-olds to gangly teenagers who tested her authority with carefully measured defiance. By the end of the first week, She had established a routine and begun to earn their respect, if not their complete obedience. Throughout it all, her thoughts often turned to Nathan. Had he found the remaining members of the Decker gang? Was he safe? The danger of his profession had never fully registered with her until now, when she found herself counting the days until his return. Mrs. Peterson, with her seemingly omniscient understanding of everyone's business, noticed Lydia's preoccupation, but said little beyond offering reassurances that Nathan had survived far more dangerous situations than tracking a couple of stagecoach robbers. Finally, Sunday arrived. Lydia woke early, her stomach fluttering with anticipation. She chose another of her frivolous dresses, this one a soft green that brought out the amber flecks in her eyes. After church, she hurried back to the boarding house to prepare for the picnic. Mrs. Peterson had packed a basket with enough food for 4 people, waving away Lydia's protests. That man's been living on trail rations for 2 weeks. He needs a proper meal. Nathan arrived at exactly noon, looking more relaxed than Lydia had ever seen him. He wore clean denims and a checked shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing. "You look lovely," he said as she emerged from the boarding house with the picnic basket. "Thank you," Lydia replied, hoping her blush wasn't too obvious. "Mrs. Peterson seems to think we need enough food to feed an army." Nathan laughed, taking the basket from her. "She knows me too well. I'm famished." They walked side by side through town and out along a well-worn path that led to the creek. It was a perfect autumn day, warm enough to be comfortable but with a crispness to the air that hinted at the coming winter. The spot Nathan had chosen was idyllic, a grassy bank beside the creek, where a large oak tree provided dappled shade. He spread a blanket on the ground and set the basket down, then offered his hand to help Lydia sit. "Did you find them?" she asked once they were settled. "The rest of the Decker gang," Nathan nodded, his expression turning serious. "Got the last 2-3 days ago, just over the territorial line. They won't be bothering any more stagecoaches. Were you in danger?" The question slipped out before Lydia could stop it. Something softened in Nathan's eyes. "Nothing I couldn't handle, but it's nice to know someone was concerned." Lydia busied herself with unpacking the basket, embarrassed by her transparent worry. "The school term has started well," she said, changing the subject. "I have 27 pupils, all eager to learn or at least pretending to be." Nathan accepted the plate of food she handed him with a grin. "I heard you've already made quite an impression. Jimmy Taylor told his father you're the smartest teacher they've ever had." "Jimmy Taylor is 11 and has had exactly 2 teachers in his life, counting me," Lydia laughed. "But I appreciate the compliment." They ate and talked, the conversation flowing easily between them. Nathan told her more about his tracking work, and Lydia shared stories from her teaching experiences. As the afternoon wore on, Lydia found herself more and more drawn to this quiet, thoughtful man whose calm exterior hid a depth of intelligence and compassion. "What made you become a tracker?" she asked as they packed away the remains of their picnic. "It seems like a solitary life." Nathan was silent for a moment, his eyes on the flowing creek. "I was a soldier first," he finally said. "During the war. After it ended, I couldn't settle back into normal life. Too many memories, I suppose. So I drifted west, took jobs where I could find them. Turned out I had a knack for tracking. And does it help? With the memories?" Nathan looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something in her that few others had noticed. "Sometimes. Being out there, it's just you and the land and the sky. Makes a man's problems seem smaller somehow." "But you still came back to Bentonville," Lydia observed softly. "I did." Nathan's voice was equally soft. "And I'm starting to think that was the best decision I've made in a long time." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Nathan stood, offering his hand to help her up. As she rose, Lydia found herself standing very close to him, close enough to see the faint scar above his right eyebrow and the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his deep blue eyes. For one breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "We should head back," he said, his voice a shade deeper than before. "It'll be getting dark soon." The walk back to town was quieter, both of them lost in their thoughts. When they reached Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, Nathan handed Lydia the empty picnic basket. "Thank you for a wonderful afternoon," he said. "I hope we can do it again sometime." "I'd like that," Lydia replied, finding herself suddenly shy. Nathan stepped back, seeming reluctant to leave. "I'll be in town for the next few weeks. The marshal's given me some time off since we brought in the Decker gang. Maybe we could have dinner one night." Lydia nodded, pleasure warming her chest. "I'd like that very much. Tomorrow night, I could pick you up at 6. "Yes, that would be lovely." With a final tip of his hat, Nathan left, and Lydia went inside, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The following weeks saw a courtship blossom between Lydia and Nathan, as proper and traditional as Mrs. Peterson could have wished, but with an undercurrent of passion that left Lydia breathless at times. They had dinner together several nights a week, went for long walks on Sundays, and Nathan even attended the school's harvest pageant where Lydia's students performed a play about the first Thanksgiving. Through their conversations, Lydia learned more about Nathan's past. He had grown up on a small farm in Kentucky, lost his parents young, and joined the Union Army at 18. The war had left its scars, both physical and emotional, but he spoke of it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. In turn, Lydia told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, her parents' decision to move west to St. Louis for her father's health, and the fever that had claimed both her mother and father in the span of a week. She described her aunt's strict household and her own determination to forge an independent life. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for," Nathan told her one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Moving across the country, starting over in a strange town, that takes courage." "Not as much courage as jumping onto a runaway stagecoach," Lydia replied with a smile. Nathan shook his head. "That was just instinct. What you did was a deliberate choice. That's real courage." As November turned to December, the weather grew colder, and the promise of the railroad's arrival dominated town conversation. Construction crews were just 10 miles outside of Bentonville, making steady progress despite the winter conditions. Nathan had been hired by the railroad company to scout the terrain ahead and report any potential problems, which kept him busy, but allowed him to return to town most evenings. Lydia found herself counting the hours until she would see him again, her feelings growing stronger with each passing day. One crisp December evening, Nathan took her to dinner at the hotel's small restaurant, which was considered the finest dining in Bentonville. Lydia wore her best dress, a deep blue velvet that she had saved for special occasions, and Nathan appeared in a proper suit that made him look startlingly handsome and slightly uncomfortable. "You clean up nicely, Mr. Keller," Lydia teased as he helped her with her chair. "Don't get used to it," he replied with a wry smile. "This suit's practically choking me." They enjoyed a wonderful meal, but Lydia noticed that Nathan seemed distracted, almost nervous. When dessert was served, he cleared his throat and reached into his pocket. "Lydia," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've never been much good with words, but I need to say something." Lydia's heart began to race as she met his earnest gaze. When I came to Bentonville, I had no intention of staying, Nathan continued. It was just another stop, another job. But then that stagecoach came tearing down the road and I saw your face at the window, and somehow everything changed. He pulled a small box from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Lydia Caldwell. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Tears sprang to Lydia's eyes as Nathan opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small diamond. It wasn't fancy or ostentatious, but it was perfect just like the man offering it. Nathan, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I love you too. Yes, I'll marry you. His face lit up with such joy that Lydia felt her heart might burst. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then leaned across the table to kiss her softly. Propriety be damned. News of their engagement spread through Bentonville like wildfire. Mrs. Peterson was ecstatic, immediately offering to host the wedding at the boarding house and launching into elaborate plans that had Lydia's head spinning. Her students were equally excited, the younger ones especially thrilled at the romantic tale of how they had met. Did Mr. Keller really jump from his horse onto a moving stagecoach to save you, Miss Caldwell? Asked 7-year-old Emma Collins during reading time. He did, Lydia confirmed, smiling at the collective gasp from her students. That's the bravest thing I ever heard, declared Jimmy Taylor with admiration. Even braver than my pa fighting off that bear. The wedding was set for Christmas Day, which gave them less than a month to prepare. The timing was partly practical. The school would be on break, and Nathan had confirmed with the railroad company that he could take 2 weeks off, but also romantic. A Christmas bride, Mrs. Peterson sighed happily as she helped Lydia alter a white silk dress that had belonged to her own daughter. In the midst of the wedding preparations, the railroad finally reached Bentonville, arriving with much fanfare on December 15th. The entire town turned out to witness the first train pulling into the hastily constructed station, bringing with it dignitaries from the railroad company, supplies for local businesses, and a sense that Bentonville had finally joined the modern world. Nathan stood beside Lydia as they watched the massive iron engine roll to a stop amid clouds of steam and the cheers of the townspeople. Progress, he murmured, squeezing her hand. For better or worse? Are you worried? Lydia asked, noting the slight furrow between his brows. Nathan shook his head, his expression clearing. Not anymore. I've found what I was looking for, even if I didn't know I was looking for it. Lydia leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. So have I. The days leading up to Christmas were a whirlwind of activity. Lydia divided her time between final wedding preparations and closing the school for the holiday break. Nathan, meanwhile, had begun construction on a small house at the edge of town, having purchased the land with his earnings from the railroad company. It wouldn't be ready by the wedding, but Mrs. Peterson had generously offered them the use of a private suite in the boarding house until their home was completed. On Christmas Eve, a light snow began to fall, dusting Bentonville in a layer of pristine white. Lydia stood at her bedroom window, watching the flakes drift down in the golden light of the street lamps. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Nathan Keller. The thought filled her with a joy so profound it was almost overwhelming. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. It was Mrs. Peterson, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. This came for you on the afternoon train, the landlady said, handing it to Lydia. Special delivery from St. Louis. Curious, Lydia unwrapped the package to find a small velvet jewelry case. Inside was a pair of pearl earrings and a note in her aunt's precise handwriting. For your wedding day, your parents would be so proud. With love, Aunt Margaret. Tears welled in Lydia's eyes. Her relationship with her aunt had been strained when she left St. Louis, but this gesture of reconciliation meant more than words could express. "They're beautiful," Mrs. Peterson said, peering at the pearls. "Will you wear them tomorrow?" "Yes," Lydia replied, carefully closing the case. "They're perfect." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the snow from the previous night glittering in the sunlight. Lydia woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning in a haze of preparation. Mrs. Peterson and several other women from town helped her dress and arrange her hair, weaving small white flowers into her chestnut locks and securing her mother's lace veil. "You look radiant," Mrs. Peterson declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Nathan Keller won't know what hit him." The wedding ceremony was scheduled for noon at the church, which had been decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the holiday. As the time approached, Lydia felt surprisingly calm. This was right. She knew it with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Sheriff Collins had agreed to escort her down the aisle in the absence of her father. When he arrived at the boarding house to collect her, resplendent in his Sunday best, he let out a low whistle of appreciation. "Miss Caldwell, you're a vision," he said, offering his arm. "That lucky son of a gun doesn't deserve you," Lydia laughed, taking his arm. "I think we deserve each other, Sheriff." The church was packed when they arrived, the entire town having turned out for the event. As the small ensemble began to play and Lydia started down the aisle on the sheriff's arm, her eyes sought and found Nathan, standing tall and proud at the altar. He wore a new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, but it was the expression on his face that took her breath away. As their eyes met, his face transformed with such love and wonder that Lydia felt tears threatening again. The ceremony itself was a blur of emotion. Lydia heard herself repeating the vows, felt the cool metal of the wedding band as Nathan slipped it onto her finger, saw the joy in his eyes as the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. And then Nathan was kissing her, a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and adventure, and the church erupted in cheers. The celebration that followed at the boarding house was the most festive event Bentonville had seen in years. Mrs. Peterson had outdone herself with the Christmas wedding feast, and someone had brought a fiddle, leading to impromptu dancing in the parlor. Lydia and Nathan moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what felt like the entire town. "Are you happy, Mrs. Keller?" Nathan whispered in her ear as they shared a quiet moment between greetings. "Completely," Lydia replied, looking up at her husband, with unabashed adoration. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he said, brushing a soft kiss against her temple. As the celebration continued into the evening, Lydia found herself thinking back to that terrifying day on the stagecoach. How close she had come to death, and how miraculous it had been that Nathan was there at that precise moment. If the stage had been attacked a day earlier or later, if Nathan hadn't heard the shots, if he had been less skilled or more cautious. "What are you thinking about?" Nathan asked, noticing her distant expression. "How everything in my life led me to that moment on the stagecoach," Lydia replied. "And how grateful I am that you were there," Nathan's eyes softened. "I think about that too. What if I'd taken a different route that day? What if I hadn't heard the shots? Then I suppose Mrs. Peterson would have had to find someone else to marry off," Lydia teased, lightening the moment. Nathan laughed, pulling her closer. Poor substitute, whoever he might have been. As the night drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Nathan took Lydia's hand and led her toward the stairs. "Mrs. Peterson says our suite is ready," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. Heat bloomed in Lydia's cheeks as she followed him, acutely aware of the knowing smiles from the remaining guests. This was another beginning, the start of their life together in every sense. The suite Mrs. Peterson had prepared for them was on the third floor, far from the other boarders. A fire crackled in the small fireplace, casting a warm glow over the comfortable furnishings. But it was the large bed, turned down and strewn with rose petals, that caught Lydia's attention, sending a flutter of nervous anticipation through her. Nathan closed the door behind them, then turned to face her, his expression suddenly uncertain. "I know this is all happening fast," he said quietly. "If you need time," Lydia placed a finger against his lips, silencing him. "I don't need time," she whispered. "I need you." His eyes darkened at her words, and then he was kissing her, really kissing her, with none of the restraint he had shown in public. Lydia melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as she returned his passion with her own. Later, much later, as they lay tangled together in the soft sheets, Lydia rested her head on Nathan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the world in silence and white. "What do you want most, Lydia?" Nathan asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "For our life together," Lydia considered the question, savoring the warmth and safety of his embrace. "A home filled with love," she finally said. "Children, perhaps, the freedom to be ourselves together. What about you?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his hand continuing its gentle exploration of her skin. "I've spent so many years just surviving," he said at last. "Moving from place to place, never putting down roots. I think what I want most is to belong somewhere to someone." He tilted her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "To you. You do belong to me," Lydia assured him, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "And I to you. That's what today was all about." Nathan smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "I thought today was about Mrs. Peterson showing off her wedding planning skills." Lydia laughed, swatting his chest playfully. "That too, perhaps." They fell silent, content in each other's arms as the night deepened around them. Lydia felt herself drifting toward sleep, more perfectly happy than she had ever been. "I love you, Lydia Keller," Nathan whispered into her hair. "I love you too," she murmured back, the words following her into dreams of all the days and years that lay ahead. Spring came early to Bentonville in 1876. By March, the snow had melted, and the first green shoots were pushing through the soil. Lydia and Nathan had moved into their new home at the edge of town just after Valentine's Day, a cozy 4-room house that Nathan had built with his own hands and the help of friends from town. The railroad had transformed Bentonville in just a few months, bringing new businesses and settlers eager to establish themselves in the growing community. Lydia's school now had 35 pupils, necessitating the hiring of an assistant teacher, and Nathan had taken a position as deputy sheriff while still occasionally doing tracking work for the marshal. Their life together had settled into a comfortable routine. Weekday mornings found them sharing breakfast before heading to their respective duties. Evenings were spent in quiet companionship by the fire, and Sundays were reserved for long rides into the countryside or visits with friends in town. It was on one such Sunday in April that Lydia realized she was expecting their first child. They had ridden to the creek where they had shared their first picnic, now lush with spring growth and wildflowers. As Nathan spread the blanket on the ground, Lydia was overcome by a wave of nausea that confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. "Are you all right?" Nathan asked, noticing her sudden pallor. "You look unwell." Lydia took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm fine." "Better than fine, actually." She took his hand, placing it over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Nathan's expression transformed from concern to wonder in an instant. "A baby, you're sure?" Lydia nodded, tears of joy welling in her eyes. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to surprise you. Nathan whooped with delight, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle before hastily setting her down again. Should I not do that? Is it safe for the baby? Lydia laughed, touched by his immediate concern. It's fine. The baby is well protected. Nathan knelt before her, placing both hands on her abdomen with reverence. Hello in there, he said softly. I'm your father. Your mother and I can't wait to meet you. Watching him, Lydia felt her heart swell with love for this man who had saved her life, and then proceeded to make that life more wonderful than she could have imagined. The news of their impending arrival spread quickly through Bentonville, with Mrs. Peterson taking particular delight in having predicted it the moment I saw them together. The town embraced the news with enthusiasm, showering Lydia with advice and Nathan with congratulatory slaps on the back. As summer approached, bringing with it scorching heat and afternoon thunderstorms, Lydia's condition became more pronounced. She continued teaching, determined to finish the school year before taking time off for the birth, which was expected in early November. Nathan grew increasingly protective, insisting on walking her to and from school despite the short distance, and spending his evenings crafting a beautiful wooden cradle for their child. His tenderness touched Lydia deeply, especially knowing how difficult it was for him to express his emotions in words. One sultry evening in July, as they sat on their porch watching a distant storm roll across the plains, Nathan surprised her with a question. You ever regret it? Coming to Bentonville, Lydia turned to look at him, one hand resting on her rounded belly. Never. How could I regret the decision that led me to you? Nathan's eyes were serious as they met hers. Even with all that happened, the stagecoach, the danger. Especially because of that, Lydia said firmly. That moment as terrifying as it was brought us together, and look at everything we have now. She gestured to their home, to her pregnant form, to the life they had built. I wouldn't change a single thing. Nathan's expression softened, and he leaned over to kiss her gently. Neither would I. Their son, James Nathan Keller, was born on a clear, cold morning in November 1876, almost exactly a year after the runaway stagecoach that had brought his parents together. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's amber-flecked eyes, and from his first wailing cry, he had both of them wrapped around his tiny fingers. Nathan proved to be a natural father, handling the baby with a confidence that surprised everyone except Lydia, who had always seen the gentleness beneath his rugged exterior. He would pace the floor with James for hours when the infant was colicky, singing old trail songs in a low, soothing voice that never failed to calm both mother and child. As James grew from an infant to a toddler, the Kellers' home expanded to include a small stable where Nathan kept Thunder, and a gentle mare named Daisy that Lydia had learned to ride. Their property now boasted a vegetable garden tended by Lydia and a workshop where Nathan built furniture for their growing family. By the time James was 3, he had been joined by a sister, Margaret Rose, named for Lydia's aunt, who had made the journey from St. Louis to meet her grand-niece and nephew, and had subsequently decided to remain in Bentonville, moving into Mrs. Peterson's boarding house and becoming a beloved fixture in the community. Bentonville itself had continued to flourish, the railroad bringing prosperity and growth. Lydia had returned to teaching part-time, with Aunt Margaret happily caring for the children during school hours. Nathan had been promoted to sheriff when Collins retired, a position that kept him closer to home most days, though he still occasionally rode out on tracking assignments when particularly dangerous criminals were involved. On a warm September day in 1880, the Keller family gathered at the creek for a picnic, to celebrate Nathan and Lydia's 5th wedding anniversary. James chased butterflies through the tall grass while Margaret toddled after him on unsteady legs, fiercely determined to keep up with her older brother. Lydia and Nathan sat on the blanket, watching their children with matching expressions of contentment. "Did you ever imagine this?" Lydia asked, leaning against her husband's solid shoulder. "That day when you jumped onto the stagecoach, did you ever think this would be your life?" Nathan's arm tightened around her waist. "Not for a moment," he admitted. "I was just trying to save whoever was inside. I didn't expect to find the woman who would save me right back." Lydia smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. They had rescued each other in ways that went far beyond that dramatic first meeting. Nathan had given her a home and a family, yes, but also the confidence to truly be herself. And she had given him roots, a place to belong, and the love he had never dared to hope for. "Mama, Papa." "Look what I found," James called, running toward them with something clutched carefully in his hands. As their son approached, proudly displaying a tiny green frog, and their daughter wobbled determinedly behind him, Lydia exchanged a look of perfect understanding with Nathan. This was what they had both been searching for, without even knowing it. This was home. The runaway stagecoach that had brought them together had been just the beginning of their adventure, an adventure that would continue through all the days of their lives, bound together by love, family, and the courage to leap into the unknown, just as Nathan had leapt from his horse onto that stagecoach on a dusty trail outside Bentonville so many years ago.